You know, I really do like talking about older movies on this channel. It is because of this desire to catch up with older cinema that I want to talk about what my favorite first-time watches in 2022 were. And yes, I am well aware that it is September 2023 at the time of posting this video. I am a chief procrastinator.
A wizard is never late, Frodo Baggins. Nor is he early. He arrives precisely when he means to.
Anyway, those quote-unquote older films deserve as much attention from the YouTube algorithm as new releases get. I'd like to have this video be the first of an annual tradition, just like my videos about the best movies and games of the year are. Now, with this being a top 10 ranking, not every movie that I watched for the first time and enjoyed in 2022 made the cut. But there are several films that I would like to recognize as honorable mentions before we get going. They will be addressed in alphabetical order. People made Barry Lyndon out to be a breezier 3-hour watch than what it felt like to me as I watched it last summer, but Stanley Kubrick's epic critique on toxic masculinity and feudal power struggles was still a great watch. I admire the craft on display in each frame, and the performances were a joy to witness. I will be eager to revisit this again sometime in the future. Given how violent I had always heard about Battle Royale being, I didn't expect for it to be so melodramatic and corny. Don't get me wrong, this story about Japanese middle schoolers being forced to fight to the death on a remote island certainly is a tragically violent and bloody affair, but witnessing the carnage intercut with teenagers confessing love to one another made for a fascinating experience, to say the least. It was a blast watching it though, especially with the energetic full house I saw it with on a Tuesday night over a year ago. The Hunger Games can eat its heart out. While I don't consider It Happened One Night to be Frank Capra's best work, the huge amount of influence that this film had on the structure of romantic comedies cannot be understated. This film established a solid formula for that kind of story, and it has remained timeless for a reason. This is an easy watch if all you want from a movie is to be entertained, since it provides entertainment value in great measure. La Haine is one of those movies that might take additional watches to fully appreciate, especially with what it's saying about our doomed society and how rough that message is conveyed. But then again, La Haine does its miserable job so well that I struggle to know when I would feel up to watching it again. That's not necessarily a criticism though, since the film makes its case about the futility and pointlessness of violence quite effectively. Such makes it easy to see why this has resonated with so many people in the years since then, even though it's not one that I particularly loved. And then last but not least, Misery is an example of director Rob Reiner just being unstoppable in the 1980s and going into the early 90s. While this may not be among his top-tier contributions to cinema, the story is still a chilling, pulpy, and massively entertaining thriller that makes great use of its performers to amplify the tension. Kathy Bates' work in particular was absolutely superb and worthy of the Oscar she won for it. This is also one of Stephen King's favorite adaptations of his stories, so that should count for something. Alright, with honorable mentions out of the way, let's move on to the actual top 10 list, starting off with Number 10! If you've encountered any Japanese art or literature in the past, chances are that you have heard of the samurai. Furthermore, one way or another, you are familiar with the basic 7 samurai narrative that many people have imitated and paid homage to over the years. Maybe it was its American remake, The Magnificent Seven, or A Bug's Life, or those times that Star Wars did it on TV. Either way, Kurosawa's grand epic about a group of warriors being hired to defend a hapless village became the standard for many films that would be made in the years to come. Granted, I will admit that the lengthy period of time spent leading up to when the action finally erupts didn't always have me gripped to the screen. It was an investment of time and energy that didn't feel entirely satisfying on my first watch earlier last year. I'm hoping that the first half goes by smoother for me when I eventually revisit it. But yeah, when the action hits, the energy never stops, and it remained cinematic even with it being a testament to the time it was all filmed. Seven Samurai won't win over everyone due to its very lengthy runtime, but I consider this to be essential viewing for anyone who claims to love movies. Number 9! Kurosawa's samurai epic is not the only film on this list to be longer than 3 hours, nor is it the only story to revolve around conflict with Japanese people. While I think Steven Spielberg's Saving Private Ryan is my preferred 1998 film about World War II, Terrence Malick did an excellent job bringing humanism to a story about a war that was largely devoid of it. An immense ensemble cast starring many recognizable actors never acts as a distraction, since they're all used effectively towards the filmmaker's grand design of exploring violence, disturbing the peace and serenity of nature. If all you want out of a movie like this is just to see some tense action scenes that place you squarely in the scenario at hand, you certainly will get that. There are many visceral sequences that bring the audience a taste of how horrific it would have been to fight in the Pacific theater of the war. Malick did have more in his mind than just depicting the action though, since the vibrant photography of the Guadalcanal landscape serves as a stark contrast to the carnage. The more that you soak in this dichotomy of destruction to serenity, it just sets in this strong sense of lament over how terrible the war was. If only the film was shorter and a bit more concise in its edit, it could have appeared much higher on the list.
Number 8!
When a beloved actor or filmmaker passes away, I usually try to watch a film of theirs to remember them by. In light of William Hurt's passing in March 2022, my wife and I picked Broadcast News, a highly regarded newsroom rom-com from the late 80s. Certainly this was a good choice for honoring Hurt's work, considering the effortless comedic timing and honesty in his performance. But the film as a whole holds a lot of value on its own merits. Given that news reporting has significantly changed in the years since 1987, it's really fascinating to see this authentic look into the intense process that went into piecing together daily news programs. Seeing these people work and thrive in their element is just fun to witness through the lens of James L. Brooks's camera. Within the confines of the DC news studio that makes up much of the film's story, you will find adult interactions that get at the real emotional vulnerability of the characters portrayed on screen. Holly Hunter and Albert Brooks round out a very lovable trio of humans with William Hurt, and I say that because each of these actors gets equal chance to share in the hilarity, melancholy, and heartbreak that is abound in this multifaceted story. I can't promise that one would leave this experience feeling completely happy with what they see, but I can at least say that this is a completely sincere and honest work of human expression.
Number 7!
It takes a very special kind of silliness to make a campy story work for me. Army of Darkness, the finale to Sam Raimi's Evil Dead trilogy, is the perfect example of this. To call this film a live-action Saturday morning cartoon is a gross understatement, for rarely has a film committed to the bit as strongly as the cast and crew did here. But I had an absolute blast, man. It almost feels like this is the film that Sam Raimi wanted to make all along, and it completely shows in just how goofy yet well crafted it is. The camera is as much of the character as the great Ash Williams or any of the meatheads fighting alongside him are, which allows the film to flourish with unbridled creativity and fun. And I really must stress that. Army of Darkness is just straight up fun. And given that it's over and done with in about 80 minutes, the entertainment value packs a wallop and doesn't overstay its welcome. Plus, all of the practical effects and costume work just adds so much more to the insane amounts of charm that this humble film has. In short, I really loved this, and it might very well be my favorite of the Evil Dead trilogy. Call that a hot take if you will, but I can't deny how much glee I felt from what was presented to me here.
Number 6!
And what is perhaps the biggest surprise of all the films featured on here is that a submarine movie ended up being ranked so high. These kinds of films are few and far between, let alone are many of them great, and yet Crimson Tide left a huge impression. A big reason for this has to do with what's at stake and how the filmmaking makes the conflict even more palpably tense. The crew of the USS Alabama is tasked with firing a nuclear warhead at Russia if an ultra-nationalist faction decides to instigate full-scale war with the US and Japan. What emerges from that scenario is equal parts popcorn thriller and morality play. For one thing, the dialogue was a lot snappier and more compelling than I had originally expected, which is likely owed to the uncredited rewrites that Quentin Tarantino contributed to the script, as well as the entertaining performances given by Denzel Washington, Gene Hackman, and others. But really, it's the commitment to basing nearly the entire story within this tight submarine that sells it. Since the tension is derived from the characters and the audience having limited information, you don't see what is happening above the surface, let alone what sorts of peace talks, if any, are occurring between the warring parties. As such, seeing comrades clash against each other in an effort to either start or prevent nuclear war results in, as my wife calls it, a real butt clench factor. Considering that this story closely parallels how narrowly nuclear war was avoided by the Soviets during the Cuban Missile Crisis, it makes sense why Tony Scott's film would feel so naturally tense, especially since the tight manner in which the submarine set is filmed adds to the claustrophobia. If you want some good old-fashioned suspense, look no further than this movie. Feel free to check out the video in which I talked about it a year ago as well.
Number 5!
The thing about satire is that if done right, that will only just get better as time goes on. American Psycho is an excellent example of this, since I expect that I will just grow to appreciate it more as time goes on. Even with this being my first watch of something that is deeply entrenched in American popular culture, I was still impressed by how much it stands alone in spite of the memes. Much of that just has to do with the fact that the movie is rooted in Patrick Bateman's depraved mind. Since Christian Bale's voiceover and the camera provide a lens into his psyche, there's no element of the movie overtly looking down on his behavior. There's a level of trust apparent in how the film boldly presents its story, and then the audience has to recognize when to laugh or when to wince. The result is something that is both wickedly entertaining and thoughtful, even if the occasional rough imagery may not make it seem as such. None of that could have really worked if director Mary Harron hadn't found a way to present Patrick Bateman's character in a reasonable way, but thankfully, she not only did that, but the film has since been deemed a modern classic. I know that I certainly look forward to future rewatches.
Number 4.
When I reviewed The Thing last Halloween, I talked about how the cold, dark, frozen tundra of Antarctica made for the best setting I had ever encountered in a horror film. I'm not saying that I will do this, but if I ever was to make a part 2 to that video, I would definitely talk about The Descent. After all, setting what is essentially a haunted house monster thriller within an uncharted cave system is genius. What makes this even better is that director Neil Marshall took the Alien approach in letting suspense build over a surprisingly long period of time, and then once the tension is released, the fight to survive against the ravenous creatures within the caves becomes a very compelling nightmare to witness on screen. Underpinning the action and terror are themes of grief, which have since become very common threads in contemporary horror, but honestly, if those elements weren't even there, The Descent would still be a very effective exercise in terror. I just appreciate when a movie can be a really solid piece of genre fiction that can be a good time even if you don't look further into it. If you do look at the film as a character piece, the story does feel a bit cliched at times, but it does take after the best horror films, and that the group of people at the story's center are steadily driven to madness by their situation. All in all, there are very few spooky movies that truly impress me these days, let alone become one of my new favorites in the genre. Fortunately for The Descent, I can comfortably call this one of my new personal favorite horror films.
Number 3.
What you will find about the next two entries is that they are examples of films that have long been canonized as classics. I always approach these movies with trepidation, since there have been plenty that just don't quite hit as hard with me as they have with other cinephiles. In the case of Bicycle Thieves, I was completely transfixed by the existential struggle that the main protagonist Antonio endures in order to provide for his family. It's not like the film does anything particularly groundbreaking with the writing or cinematography in order to get its points across. Compared to some of the other films on this list, Bicycle Thieves is a simple depiction of a sad chapter in a man's life. But if we were to consider cinema as a means of developing empathy for our fellow man, then this film is a prime example of such an idea. A lot of this probably has to do with the fact that the lead actor was a non-professional at the time of the film's release, being cast in the film as an amateur. And yet this lack of theatricality in his performance lends to him being completely authentic as the main character, since we spend practically the entire film observing him fumble around Rome trying to make ends meet. What ensues from there is a lean, excellently crafted story that is just as full of humanity as it is cynicism towards the harsh realities of post-war Europe. The phrase, "you can't understand someone until you've walked a mile in their shoes," applies perfectly to this story, and surely that sensibility is what has helped Bicycle Thieves stand the test of time.
Number 2.
Now, much like the aforementioned Bicycle Thieves, The Passion of Joan of Arc, a seminal French silent film from the late 1920s, harbors a lot of the same traits. It is less than 90 minutes long, the story is quite straightforward, and the film serves as an empathetic lens in which one can view history. But what causes it to edge out the Italian classic is that the language of cinema does wonders to convey many of its ideas. I mean, you would expect that from a silent film where vocalized dialogue is not a tool at the filmmaker's disposal. Even so, the choice to frame many of the shots with very harsh close-ups is extremely effective, the likes of which are often slightly angled in order to emphasize a character's position of power or lack thereof. This is necessary since the film never concerns itself with trying to show proof that Joan of Arc was called by God to lead the French to victory. We only ever see things as though we were a silent observer in the stone halls where Joan was interrogated as a heretic. So, all we would have to go off are the testimonies or accusations of those in the room. All the while, the set design is so purposefully depicted as objects of oppression working against Joan's favor. And of course, it goes without saying that Renée Maria Falconetti gave one of the greatest performances in the history of cinema, bar none. Her eyes alone are so integral to the emotional rawness of her character, so much so that even if one doesn't believe Joan's claims of divine destiny, her conviction is unmistakable. The world has largely seemed to convince itself that there's nothing remotely compelling about black and white cinema, let alone silent ones, and I strongly encourage anyone who feels this way to experience this masterpiece for themselves. People widely consider this to be one of the greatest miniseries ever made, and while I haven't seen that many miniseries in my lifetime, this chronicle of the 101st Airborne's Easy Company is seriously riveting television nonetheless. Just like Saving Private Ryan, the film that served as its stylistic frame of reference, the show makes an effort to move away from the myth-making and glamorization of violence that war films are typically known for. Same goes for the vast array of real-life characters who populate the ranks of Easy Company, which is really what allows the show to shine. Sure, it's full of the dense effects work, cinematography, and visual gravitas that we've now come to expect from a serious HBO production, but they only serve to buttress a story that never forgets the human toll of World War II. And I'm not just talking about the actual lives lost. The war was a living nightmare that exposed men to their most primal fears and deepest regrets. The series does well to shed light on how each of Easy Company's major participants in the war effort were affected by it all. And certainly none of their personal journeys are cliched. Some of the moments interlaced throughout these soldiers' journeys are quite mundane, but even in these more subdued moments, there's something to be learned about what these poor men had to suffer through. Whether it be the horrific shelling of Allied foxholes in the Ardennes, the initial drop into Nazi-occupied France on D-Day, or the accidental discovery of a Jewish concentration camp, the show treats all of its moments, big and small, with the proper attention each one deserves. Not a single episode goes wasted, even if some may be more tense or dramatic than others. Ultimately, Band of Brothers checked all the necessary boxes for me to consider this a worthwhile look into one of the most storied periods of world history. That filmic insight is both fascinating on just a cinematic and educational level, while never losing the heart that makes one empathize with these men. Above all, that careful balance of an emotional core with pushing the boundaries of filmmaking in groundbreaking ways is why this is my favorite first-time watch of 2022. It may be a while before I go back and revisit the heart-wrenching story of Easy Company, but when I do, I'm sure that I will be sucked right back in. And that's it! Thank you for your patience in me getting this video out to you. If you liked what you saw and would be eager to see more of what I have to offer, please consider subscribing to the channel and joining the notification squadron so that you won't miss out on my future videos. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you all have a great one.